There's a sound nobody tells you about. A small sound, metal on metal, like a latch catching on a screen door. That's what a bouncing Betty sounds like when you step on it. Just a click, and then there's a pause, maybe half a second, maybe less, where the mind sits under the dirt deciding whether to kill you. That half second lasted the rest of my life. I was 20 years old, standing in frozen mud in a forest I couldn't pronounce the name of, and the click didn't come from under my boot. It came from under Hank Olson's. He was 2 feet to my left, close enough to touch, close enough that when I turned and looked at him, I could see he already knew. His face didn't twist up or go pale the way you'd think. His eyes just settled on mine, quiet, like he was trying to hand me something without words. And then his mouth opened, and what came out? I've heard it every night for 80 years, but I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what that forest was before you can understand what it took from us. I got to the Hürtgen the second week of November, 1944. Replacement. That's what they called me. Not soldier, not private. Replacement. Like a part for a machine, shipped up in a truck with 8 other guys who looked exactly as green and sick as I felt. The 28th Infantry Division, the bloody bucket, had already been chewed up bad. When I stepped off that truck, nobody looked at us. A sergeant pointed me to a foxhole that still had another man's blood frozen to the lip of it and told me to get in. That was my welcome. Danny McGuire was the first one to talk to me like I was human. Corporal, wiry little guy from Flatbush, always had a cigarette going, even in the rain. He'd been in since North Africa, Kasserine, Sicily, Omaha Beach, and by all rights should have been the hardest man in the company. But Danny talked. He sat down next to my foxhole that third night and said, "You look like someone walked you to the gallows and forgot to tell you what you did." He told me who to listen to, where the German lines were, how to tell incoming from outgoing by the pitch of the whistle. "Stick close to me, Pennsylvania. I didn't survive this long by being stupid." Then there was Hank. Private First Class Henry Olson from some nowhere town in Minnesota. Big kid, 6'2", with hands that made his rifle look like a toy. He reminded me so much of my older brother it hurt. Hank didn't say much. He had a steadiness about him, like a barn beam. You just felt safer with him around. Every night, no matter how close the shells were falling, he'd write a letter to his wife, Margaret. She was pregnant, due in February. He'd taped her photograph inside his helmet, a little black and white snapshot of a girl with dark hair and a serious face, and sometimes I'd catch him just sitting with his helmet in his lap, looking at her, not smiling, just memorizing. Lieutenant Ashworth ran our platoon, 23, 24 years old, blonde hair always in his eyes, a college kid's face on a body too thin from weeks of short rations. He was scared. You could see it in how tight he held his jaw, the muscle jumping under his ear. But he never sent us somewhere he wasn't willing to go first. The first patrol I went on, Ashworth was on point, not behind us giving orders from cover. On point, walking into the dark ahead of everyone. That's the whole difference between an officer men will die for and one they won't. Now, the forest. I need to talk about it because the Hürtgen wasn't a place. It was a living thing, and it hated us. Fir trees packed so dense the branches interlocked overhead like fingers. Sunlight didn't reach the ground. By noon, it looked like dusk. The floor was roots and needles and mud so deep it sucked your boots off. Rain came down cold and steady, never hard enough to be dramatic, just enough to make sure you were never dry. Your socks rotted on your feet. But the worst was the tree bursts. Germans aimed their artillery into the canopy, and when shells hit those trunks, they exploded at head level and sent jagged splinters, long as your forearm, screaming down like knives. I saw a man killed by a piece of pine that went through his chest. Through, not into. The trees that were supposed to be cover were trying to kill you, and the mines, shoe mines, bouncing betties, tripwires. Every step off the trail was a dice throw. I watched a man step 3 feet off the path to relieve himself and lose both legs below the knee. 3 feet. He was screaming, and I could see the white of the bone, and the medic was shouting for morphine, and the rest of us just stood there on the trail, terrified to move, terrified to kneel down and help, because every inch of ground might be another mine. After that, some guys just went where they stood. Nobody judged them for it. You judge a man for his dignity, or you judge him for his life. Out there, it wasn't a hard choice. Around the 19th of November, Ashworth gathered what was left of us, 32 men, down from full strength, and said we were ordered to take a German position on a ridge 800 yards northeast. He had a map spread on a fallen log and a flashlight with a red filter, and his hand was steady while he pointed, but his voice had a thinness to it, a hollowness. 2 machine gun emplacements, minefields on the approach, no armor support because tanks couldn't get through the terrain. He folded his map and said, "I know what I'm asking. I'm asking anyway." Nobody spoke. Danny lit a cigarette and blew the smoke straight up into the dark. Somewhere behind us, a stretcher team carried another man out of the line. We could hear the bearer's boots squelching in the mud and the soft animal sounds the wounded man was making. Nobody watched. You learned not to watch. That night, Hank wrote a longer letter than usual. I could hear his pencil from my foxhole. Scratch, 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 pause, more scratching. I wanted to say something real to him, but what do you say? Everything sounded cheap and hollow, so I said nothing. After a while, the scratching stopped, and I heard him whisper something. I think it was her name. That was the last quiet moment I remember. We stepped off in the dark, no moon. You followed the man ahead by sound, breathing, footsteps, the clink of gear. Danny was in front of me, Hank behind. Single file because of the mines, each man stepping in the boot print of the man ahead. For 20 minutes, nothing. Just the forest and our breathing and distant artillery, someone else's nightmare. Then a branch snapped to our right, and every man froze. My heart missed a beat. We waited. 5 seconds. 10. A deer. Danny looked back and grinned in the dark. "Bambi's got more guts than half the U.S. Army," he whispered. I wanted to strangle him and thank him at the same time. That was Danny. Even standing in a minefield in the pitch dark waiting to die, the man could find the joke. I think it was the only thing keeping him sane. I think it was the only thing keeping any of us sane. We kept moving. Another hour. The terrain sloped upward and the trees thinned just enough to let in a gray half-light. Dawn wasn't far, and then the first tree burst hit. The crack split the air open, then silence, then splinters raining down and screaming. 2 men near the front went down. Danny yelled to spread out, against everything about the mines. But tree bursts kill faster when you're bunched. You pick your poison. Second burst, third. The Germans had our approach dialed, walking shells down the column like a man stomping ants. I pressed against a tree so hard the bark cut my cheek and watched a shell explode 30 feet above me. A splinter the size of a ruler embedded in the trunk 6 inches from my face. I remember thinking, very calmly, that I was going to die in this forest, and nobody back home would ever understand what it was like. Not panic, not fear, arithmetic. We pushed forward because back was no better. We hit the base of the ridge and the MG-42s opened up. If you've never heard one, I hope you never do. It doesn't sound like a machine gun. It sounds like a bedsheet tearing, 1,200 rounds a minute, so fast you can't tell individual shots. The air above our heads became a solid wall of noise and metal. Everyone went face down, mud jumping like it was boiling. We couldn't advance, couldn't retreat. I felt something hot crease the back of my calf. A round had nicked me, barely, just enough to let me know it could have been worse. Danny was behind a shattered log, firing in short bursts at a muzzle flash he could barely see. He screamed for Ashworth to flank left. There was a dip in the ground, 20 yards out. But Ashworth was already moving. Took 4 men crawling toward a shallow fold in the terrain. His blond hair dark with mud, moving like a man who'd made peace with what was coming. They got maybe 15 yards. I didn't see the round that hit him, just heard lieutenants down, and the world tilted. Danny swore, a vicious combination I'd never heard assembled in that particular order, and then his voice changed, hard, flat. He turned to us, the 8 or 9 who could still move, and said, "Ridge isn't gonna take itself. On me. Stay low, move fast, shoot at anything that isn't us." No speeches, just a skinny kid from Brooklyn deciding somebody had to go. My legs moved before I decided. Danny was ahead, firing from the hip. Hank was beside me. Big shoulders hunched, face set steady, like he was walking into a barn to start chores instead of into machine gun fire. The MG-42 on the right went quiet. Jammed or hit, I never knew. The left one kept going, rounds kicking dirt geysers all around us. A man 3 paces ahead dropped like his strings were cut. I didn't stop. Couldn't. 40 yards from the German position, Hank stopped. I was a step ahead and turned because I felt his absence the way you feel sudden silence. He was standing still, 1 foot forward, and the look on his face was the look of a man who's just heard a sound no one should ever have to recognize. The click. He looked at me. The gunfire was still there, but I couldn't hear it anymore. Everything funneled down to his face and the 2 feet between us. He knew what he was standing on. I knew what he was standing on. And for that half-second, that tiny, infinite half-second, neither of us breathed. His lips moved. I had to read them more than hear them. "Tell Margaret I—" He didn't finish. The mine launched. There's a reason they call it a bouncing Betty. It springs up, a small dark shape rising out of the dirt to about waist height, and then it detonates, so the blast catches you in the middle of your body where it can do the most damage. I saw it come up. I saw it hang there for what felt like a year, and then the world turned white. The sound. I don't have words. 80 years of not having words. I felt the concussion in my teeth, in my spine, in the backs of my eyes. Something hot and wet hit my face. I went down blind and deaf, the world a white shriek of nothing, and when I could see again, when the ringing thinned enough to let in other sounds, Hank wasn't there anymore. Not the way he'd been, not the way anyone should ever have to see another human being. His helmet rolled to a stop against my knee, face down, the photograph still inside. We took the ridge. I don't remember the last 50 yards. I know Danny got us there. I know at some point I was standing in a ruined log bunker with a dead German boy at my feet who looked younger than me. I know I sat down shaking and realized I'd been crying without knowing when I started. Danny sat next to me, lit a cigarette with hands barely steadier than mine. After a while he said, "Olson?" I shook my head. He took a long drag and said, God. Just the one word. Ashworth survived. Gut wound, evacuated to an aid station. I heard later he pulled through, but I never saw him again. Never wrote. I wish I had. The ridge we'd bled for was nothing. A hump of frozen dirt with some logs piled on it, and a view of more forest stretching into gray nothing. No crossroads, no town, no bridge, no strategic value that any of us could see or that anyone ever explained. 14 men dead for a piece of ground you wouldn't stop your car to look at. I peeled Margaret's photograph from Hank's helmet. Damp, but intact. That serious face looking up at me. I folded it and put it in my breast pocket. I've never taken it out. 80 years. New wallets, new houses, a buried wife of my own. That picture has been within arm's reach every day since November 1944. We ate cold rations in a crater. Nobody talked about Hank. You didn't. You packed it deep and kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant hearing the click and watching his lips form words he never finished. A bird started singing somewhere in the broken trees, just one, high and clear, completely mad, like it hadn't gotten word about what happened here. Danny looked up at it and said, "Somebody tell that bird to read the room." I laughed. Actually laughed, sitting next to frozen blood and spent casings, and the laugh came out cracked in the middle, and Danny put his hand on my shoulder and left it there. When they pulled the 28th out of the Hürtgen, the division had lost thousands. For a forest. A dark, wet forest nobody back home had heard of. The histories call it a defeat now. I could have told them that at the time. I came home in '45. Took the train back to Lancaster, and my mother was on the platform, and her face crumpled right in the middle of her smile, like she could see everything I wasn't saying. I held her and smelled flour and coffee on her clothes, and felt absolutely nothing. That's what the Hürtgen took, not a limb, not my eyesight. It took the part of me that could feel things at normal volume. Everything after the war was either too loud or too quiet, and nothing was ever the right size. Fireworks put me on the floor for 30 years, flat on my belly in the living room while my kids stared at me from the doorway, too young to understand why Daddy was on the ground. I married a patient woman and never told her the whole truth. She knew there was a room inside me she couldn't enter, and she had the grace not to force the door. She'd put her hand on my chest at 3 in the morning and say, "You're home," and I'd nod in the dark, but part of me was still in those trees. Part of me is still there now. I don't think it ever came home. Danny made it back to Brooklyn, married an Italian girl, ran a plumbing supply shop for 40 years. We wrote letters for a while, real letters, long ones, the kind where you say the things you couldn't say out loud. Then the letters got shorter. Then it was just Christmas cards with a photograph of his kids. Then nothing. He died in 2003. I didn't find out until months later. His daughter wrote me. I sat in my kitchen and cried like a child, and when my daughter asked what was wrong, I said, "A friend passed." A friend. Like he was someone I played golf with. Danny Maguire saved my life when I was 20 years old in a forest in Germany, and the best word I could find was friend. Hank Olsen. I say his name out loud sometimes, just to hear it, just to make sure it still sounds real and not like something I dreamed in that forest 80 years ago. Margaret had the baby in February of '45, right on schedule, just like he said she would. A girl, I know her name. I looked it up years later, went to the library, found the birth records. I know where she lives. She's in her 80s now, which is a thing I can't make my brain accept, because in my head she's still the unborn baby that a big quiet kid from Minnesota was writing letters to by candlelight in a frozen foxhole. She never heard his voice. He never held her, and I was 2 feet away and couldn't do a single thing about it. I've picked up the phone 100 times, written letters I never mailed. What would I say? That I was standing right there? That the last word on his lips was her mother's name and he didn't get to finish it? How do you put that in an envelope? How do you knock on a stranger's door and hand her the worst moment of your life? People thank me for my service. They mean well. But service isn't the word. The word is survival, and survival isn't something you thank a man for. It's something he apologizes for, quietly, every morning, to the men who didn't get the same luck. I keep that photograph right here, edges soft as cloth now. Margaret's face has faded, but I can still see her. Every day I look at it. Every day I think about finishing his sentence. And every day I close the wallet and carry him one more day, because that's all I know how to do. 80 years. I never knocked on that door.